Hang on, we're so close. And we're live, okay. So, thank you everyone for coming. I see that there are actually a couple people watching already, which is sweet. I am here today with theoretical physicist Tom McClain. And if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that my name is Virginia McClain, and you may find it somewhat suspicious that I am interviewing Tom McClain. And yes, he is my brother, but he's also a very intelligent and interesting person. And despite the fact that he was raised with me, somehow that happened. And and he is a theoretical physicist, and he's also a very creative and interesting person. And so today we are going to talk about a lot of cool topics, including the intersectionality of science and arts. So I have to actually get my questions up. That was the thing I forgot to do. Luckily, they're right here. Phew.
That's a lot to live up to. I'll do my best.
Yeah, well, so yeah, but thank you so much for joining us, Tom. The struggle for me is going to be to call you by your actual name instead of your childhood nickname.
I think it'll be all right.
I apologize in advance for that. But yeah, so folks who are around, feel free to ask questions at some point. AF Stewart is there. Hey. And I bet you that Misty will show up at some point, and maybe some other people. So we've got some of our regular viewers are here. We'll see who else shows up. And yeah, so Tom, normally I have to like stalk people on Facebook to get personal info about them for these interviews. I did not have
it was a little easier in this.
Yeah. In fact, you may have noticed that there aren't any like personal questions in the interview with it. It's because I was like, well, certainly those I can shoot from the hip. But I also, I mean, so I usually try to make these a balance of, you know, personal stuff and professional stuff. But I also hesitate to go too personal because it's like we could talk forever about stupid inside jokes if we get rolling, and so try to keep us on the straight and narrow-ish. So we'll start with professional stuff. We'll assert your credibility first, and then and then we'll move on to the ridiculousness that is being related to me. So so there are people watching, and there's a whole there may be people watching later that have never met or talked to a theoretical physicist. There may be people watching now who've never met or talked to a theoretical physicist. Although I did just see Jill showed up, so we can say hi to Jill. Hi, Jill. And they may want to know, because certainly I don't think if I weren't related to you, I'm not sure that I would know the answer to this. What does a theoretical physicist actually do, Tom?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, really, the answer depends a little bit on the theoretical physicist. So physics in general is the study of matter and energy, right? And in particular, its interactions. But theoretical physics is used in at least two different ways in the physics community. The first one is the sort of broader and actually maybe slightly less used term. If you just say theoretical physics, most people are going to assume something else. But theoretical physics in its broadest sense is the physics that looks at the mathematics of physics and interpreting that mathematics and relating it to physical concepts. Now, it might be helpful there to distinguish between theoretical physics, which is what we're talking about, and experimental physics, which is the physics of actually running, building apparatus, running experiments, taking data, et cetera, right? So we're distinguishing theoretical physics from that experimental side of physics. So we're saying the people who look at the mathematics, the equations, who try to interpret those equations, who try to come up with new equations to describe new physics, new physical results, those are all theoretical physicists in the broadest sense. However, there's also a more specialized use of the term theoretical physics, which, as I said, is maybe the more common one. If you say theoretical physicist without any further qualification, usually people are going to assume that what you really mean is a high energy theoretical physicist, which means looking at really, really tiny phenomena, right? So trying to push beyond the currently understood boundaries of what we know about the very smallest, most fundamental constituents of matter and the models of energy that we have, things like that. So if you wanted to say something else, right, if you wanted to refer to one of those broader theoretical physicists in the broadest sense, then you would probably say something like, say like solid state theory or something like that, right? So you'd say like a solid state theoretical physicist or something like that. Because if you don't add a qualification, people are going to assume that by theoretical physicist you mean what I am, which is somebody who looks at this tries to figure out the most fundamental sort of particles and interactions and things like that.
The absolute fabric of the universe.
Well, I mean, that's yes. If you ask a string theorist, they're going to tell you the absolute fabric of the universe, right? Because everything is oscillating strings. Some of us are a little bit more small c conservative in our outlook about what we're doing, right? We're trying to at least take the next step.
Right.
I think we would all at least feel comfortable saying that. Some might say, yes, we're going to do a grand unified theory, and that's going to be the end of the road.
Okay, so so that is a very specific and niche field to jump into. Not that it doesn't sound amazingly interesting, well, to at least a nerd like me, but you know, as a small child, one may not sit around and think, gosh, you know, I really want to be a theoretical physicist when I grow up. One might, but one might not. So what made you wish to become a physicist? Like what, you know, what, and this is a question that I actually am asking genuinely, because I think despite the fact that I've known you my entire life, I'm not actually sure if we've had these conversations yet. Like what made you choose physics out of everything?
Yeah, I think the reason is because it was a very strange road. I mean, as you pointed out, certainly I, as a child, did not want to be a theoretical physicist. I wanted to be a ninja, right? Like I had no interest in science, even generally, right? I was, and even in high school, I remember feeling like science and mathematics were the things that were harder for me, not easier. So what perversely led me to choose the things that I found to be harder to get into? I think that's actually precisely the answer.
Oh.
I chose it because it seemed like it was going to be something that was really hard to do, and sure enough, it was. It was hard to do. It was a struggle for me every time that I studied it as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate student, and then as a PhD student. But that challenge is really is sort of what drew me in, right? The fact that there were these really difficult questions that nobody knew how to answer, but that we believed had so not only some fundamental significance, which was part of what makes for the challenge, but also that have some, we believe as physicists, that have some objective answers at the end of the road, right? And so I think the combination of the difficulty and this, you know, this carrot, which is always, you know, always a little bit out in front of me, it seems like, of eventually coming to some really fundamental answers to some fundamental questions that are objective in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the questions are huge and impressive, and would be really freaking cool to answer.
Right.
On their own, not to mention all the Nobel Prizes and shit that would come if you did. But like,
you know, actually, though, Nobel Prizes, especially these days, are more often given for experimental work rather than theoretical work.
Interesting.
Not always, right? So having said that, I now have to supply the caveats, right? Roger Penrose, who was the winner this year, won for definitely theoretical work.
Oh yeah.
That was mathematical and theoretical physics of black holes. But the other half of the prize was two experimentalists. And as I said, I think that's actually a little bit more common at this point.
I mean, presumably it is now more common to make breakthroughs with the tech side of things than it is to make breakthroughs with the theory at this stage?
Well, yeah, I mean, so part of the problem with the theory right now is that theory has outstripped experiment by such a wide margin at this point. Well, okay, so that's maybe not the right way to put it. Theorists right now are proposing all sorts of ideas. So this includes string theory, this includes quantum gravity, all of which are in this sort of like quantum theories of gravity research program. It's not really a research program, paradigm. How about that?
Okay.
Of which I'm part. They proposed all these ideas, but they are completely untestable with current technology. You know, our best guess, and it is a guess, is that to directly probe quantum gravitational phenomena, we would need energies that were so many orders of magnitude beyond what we can produce at CERN in a particle collider that it's sort of ludicrous, right? I mean, the back of the envelope calculation is that you would need a particle collider about the size of the Milky Way galaxy in order to reach those sorts of energies. So naturally, the NSF is not wild about funding that. So So right now, there's a big challenge for all of these research programs to try to come up with anything that any prediction, right? Any hypothesis that is related to what they're doing that might actually be testable in some sort of feasibility.
Okay.
Now, of course, we all hope that there are some backdoors that we can take, right? Nobody wants to wait until we build a particle collider the size of the Milky Way galaxy before testing their hypotheses, right? So the hope is always that there are maybe some astrophysical phenomena that already exist, which probe those energies without us needing to build anything that we can observe rather than having to build and directly experiment with. Or that a quantum gravitational theory might provide us with answers to other questions, like the nature of dark matter or dark energy or something like that. And if it could supply a good quantitative prediction to fill in some of those gaps, that would be taken, I think, as strong indirect evidence for a particular quantum theory of gravity. But right now, the struggle is to say anything.
Right.
That is testable or related to observation or anything like that, right? So there's a sense in which we've all gone round the bend. And so we need to maybe re-examine some of our assumptions. But anyway.
But surely the Milky Way galaxy is in some degree its own particle collider, right? Like,
well, right,
that's the idea of the people observing phenomena that are already occurring, right?
Yeah, so, that's exactly right. Yeah. So presumably there already are these sort of naturally occurring particle colliders or other phenomenon where strong field gravitation and quantum fields are interacting, and so you get some interesting quantum gravitational effects. Right. Presumably that is happening in many places in the universe. Right. And so the question is then, how do we observe those things, and how do we observe them in a way that will shine some light on some of these quantum gravitational research programs?
Right. Which is a very cool question and problem, I think. Again,
yeah, it is. Unfortunately, the person you're talking to is someone who does more of like thinking big ideas on his whiteboard back there, right? And less of the let's actually think about how we might test these big ideas. This is actually, I think, part of the reason why we're in such a strange situation right now is because it's easy to convince someone who is 20 years old, no, not 20 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old, right? Who's in a PhD program. Wouldn't it be cool to sit around and think big thoughts? Much harder to convince someone. Wouldn't it be cool to spend decades of your life building something with painstaking, detail,
precision?
Right, exactly. And thank goodness that there are so many people who are willing to do that. But again, I think we have too many theoretical physicists probably, and I should count myself among them because it seems so much more fun to just sit around and think shit up, right? And to actually like work hard for a living.
Which is why I became a writer of fiction.
Well, maybe I should have done the same thing.
Hey, it's two sides to the same coin, I think.
It may in fact be that I did do the same thing. My works of fiction get fewer reads than yours. They get published in scientific journals that no one reads.
Well, hey, not all my books get more reads than that. So.
Okay. Fair enough. This is not a good competition to be in, I think.
No, it's a race to the bottom. But I'm gonna look to see if we've got any comments on our okay, we don't have any questions coming in yet. There is a 20 second delay, and I haven't actually asked for questions. But folks, as you're watching, again, we do have a few actual people watching it live, which is great. One of them is definitely our sister, but there are a few others that I think are not related to us. But so folks, if you have questions as you hear Tom talk about stuff, please feel free to put them in here. This is a jargon-heavy field, and if there are any questions you have about what's being said, please throw them at us, and I will have Tom clarify. And it's good to get him to do it while he's here, because I can never remember the explanation an hour after the conversation has happened. So even though I understand what he's talking about while he's talking about it, you ask me an hour from now and I won't be able to explain it to you. So please ask questions while Tom is here to answer them, because he at least knows what he's talking about. Most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah, that's a good caveat. Most of the time, but it is definitely a field where it's hard to know the players without the program. So unless you do this all the time, it's very, very easy to lose track of what's happening.
I appreciate you coddling my ego that way. So let's talk about what you actually do. So you are a theoretical physicist. You do, as you have said, sit in a room and think shit up as part of your job. But you that's not the only part of your job currently. And my question is, out of all the parts of your job, you describe a few parts of your job, and which parts are the highlights for you? Like what do you like the most out of the things that you're doing?
That's a really great question. I mean, the first thing to say is that actually very few people who would self-identify as theoretical physicists are only theoretical physicists, right? So those of us who are in academia, like me, are first and foremost professors, right? I'm really a professor of physics, not really a theoretical physicist, right? Theoretical physics is what I do on breaks and to get promoted and to get hired and things like that, right? But actually our job is always, those of us who are in academia, is to teach, right? That's what we actually get paid for. So I do a lot of teaching. And so during the term, I don't spend a tremendous amount of time on theoretical physics. The first year that I was teaching at the university level, making my own courses and all those sorts of things, I did zero research. Now that I'm into it for a while, I actually do. Yes, exactly. Right. So now that the classes are faster for me to prepare, it is, I do get to do some research during the term, but right now is break. So right now I really am a little bit more of a theoretical physicist in terms of the day-to-day. And so actually you can see on the whiteboard, this was not just for the interview.
Actually, you didn't just scribble down a bunch of randoms. What
I was doing, so I was working on some stuff for a paper that I'm working on.
Nice.
So yeah, but there is a lot of sitting around, thinking things up.
You might be thinking around a thing.
Well, yeah, that happens a lot too. But, and then of course there's the writing component, right? After you've had some sort of idea that you want to explore, you have to work through it. And different people have different strategies for working through it. So sometimes it really is on a whiteboard, right? And you start writing out equations and you try to figure out what the sort of quantitative side of your idea is. Your idea may be quantitative in nature to begin with. And then at some point you want to take that idea and you want to introduce other people to it. And so that's where the writing process begins, if not earlier, right? Some of us actually write even when we don't necessarily know if it's going to be a publishable result. We write to organize our thoughts. We write to have some place where we can keep ideas and equations and things. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like if I leave it on the whiteboard, it's going to get erased, right? And it's going to. So there's actually a lot of writing that is involved in doing theoretical physics. It's a lot of writing with a lot of equations, right? But equations without words are not only figuratively but literally
just numbers.
Usually they're actually not numbers. There are very few numbers in the equations that we write. So usually it's a lot of symbols.
It's a lot of Greek and a lot of letters.
No, that's exactly right. It's a lot of Greek letters. So if you look up there, I don't know how much you can actually see in the picture, right?
You can make out a few things.
P's and etas and G's and right, and all of those stand for particular physical concepts, right? Which they're quantitative concepts, otherwise they wouldn't be there in an equation. But they're, the G is the metric tensor field, and the phi is the Klein-Gordon field, et cetera, right? So without those words to go along with it, unless everybody already in the audience understands what the symbols mean, which is a little touch and go sometimes because some of us use different symbols for different things. There's a certain amount of standardization, but it's not standardized in the way that even the English language is, let alone,
and the English language is not as standardized.
Right. Let alone something with a Royal Academy. So it's, there are always lots and lots of words to go along with the equations. So a lot of thinking things up, a lot of doing mathematics, a lot of writing. And then there's also something which is really fun, which is getting your ideas out there. So part of that we do with writing. And then there's a whole editorial process and a reviewer process and all of that before publication happens. That's the peer review process. And then after you publish something, you very often want to go and tell people about it, right? Because you know that nobody read it yet, unless
you tell them.
Unless you're much more eminent than I am. So if I publish something, I know that nobody read it. And if you're Ed Witten and you write something, you know that everybody read it. But that's okay. Everybody means everybody within the little tiny community, right, of 1,000 people that we work in. But yeah, so then you might want to go to a conference, or you might want to, just email or call up your collaborators and tell them, your collaborators on other projects, and tell them, hey guys, I published something new. Isn't that interesting? And then hope that they read it after that. So those are some of the pieces.
Yeah.
Although by no means all.
And then, and the highlights for you then, like what out of all those pieces, what continuously brings you satisfaction, or just occasionally brings you satisfaction, but brings so much that it's a highlight?
No, I mean, I think so. In terms of my actual job, I really do love the teaching side of my job, but that isn't really, as I said, that isn't really theoretical physics, right?
Right.
So on the theoretical physics side, my favorite part, as you would imagine, is the sitting around thinking shit up part. I honestly sometimes find the details and the mathematics rather onerous, but the sitting around and thinking shit up and wondering like, hey, wait, what if we did it like this instead? Is that just crazy? And then usually, you work out some mathematics and you're like, oh yeah, that is crazy. Like I didn't think of this or this or this, and those are all reasons why this just doesn't work. But that is definitely the fun part for me, is especially the 5 seconds to 30 seconds after you've just come up with some idea and before the side of your brain that realizes how bad it is kicks into play, right? That short time period of like, oh, I smell a breakthrough. That part is really, really fun.
That is awesome, because that happens to me with book ideas all the time. And it's the exact same thing where you have this moment where you're like, oh yes, this is brilliant. No one has done this. It's going to be so good.
Right.
And then eventually the little voice in the back is like, are you crazy? Like no, that has been done. Here are all the times that's been done. And here's the way in which it's been done better. And he's like, damn it.
Sure.
So I love that that's like totally a part of the process for both.
No, I think for better or worse that's a ubiquitous part of just the creative process, right? Is that you have these ideas, and then at some point, as long as you're a good creative, you have to actually critique those ideas, right? And that other side of your brain has to come in and be like, whoa. I think this one's going in the trash basket, not to the publisher, right?
Yeah. That is cool. And actually it leads very nicely into my next question. So I'm just going to dive into that one. So my next question was, do you think that science and art overlap, and if so, where? So let's just jump into that, the meat of a lot of what we're going to
do. And I think you're right that's a fantastic segue, because I think the place where they do overlap so strongly is in the fact that they're both very creative fields. And I think that we don't usually think about that. I mean, everybody acknowledges that art is creative, right? But I think most people would say, well, no, science is not really creative at all, right? For instance, the language that we use about science would indicate that it's not really creative, right? We discover scientific law, right? We don't author scientific law, which is a bad term, because let me tell you, we do actually author scientific law. It's nonsense, right? The equations are not out there for us to look at, right? There's no it's not like you find a new rock somewhere in South America and you look at it and you're like, oh my God, look, the equation is this. No, right? Obviously that's not how it works, and everybody knows that that's not how it works.
Right.
But people don't necessarily, I think within the scientific community, people don't want to acknowledge the fact that scientific laws, scientific equations, scientific theories, scientific hypotheses are authored rather than discovered. And so I think that's the language that we in the scientific community use, and so that's the language that people outside the scientific community use. But it means that I don't think that there's a lot of understanding about the creative process of doing science. And this is not just, by the way, theoretical physics in either of the two senses. This is experimental physics is just as creative, in maybe more in some ways. This is theoretical and experimental physicists are both trying to solve really, really challenging problems that always require new ideas. And so it is the process of coming up with those new ideas that is ubiquitous.
Right.
And so I think that's the similarity. Now, obviously, the standards by which we judge the finished product are at least hopefully different between the two. Now, I say hopefully.
You like to think.
In theoretical physics right now, high energy theory, right, is quantum gravity programs, especially like mine, the line gets blurred And it is an absolute lie to say that string theorists, loop quantum gravity people, and even people who work on much smaller research programs like mine, it is definitely a lie to say that aesthetics and just subjective preference don't play a substantial role in terms of determining what people work on and when. And they may not have much of a stronger why than that, to be honest.
I mean, with literally the entire universe as a choice, right? You need something to narrow it down.
No, and I think that's exactly right. And at its best, physics in particular and science in general relies on experiment to drive those sorts of decisions about what it is that we're going to work on. But in a field that seems so divorced from experimental input, we often end up relying on more artistic sounding criteria to work on. But again, that's really not the way that science is supposed to work. And string theory in particular gets a lot of flack sometimes on this end, right? Like, well, why do string theory, right? Like this seems like a very counterintuitive sort of thing, right? We've got 10 or 11 space-time dimensions now, and you've got, you're telling us that like everything in the universe is an oscillation on a little string, but we've never observed any strings. This all seems very strange, right? So why do we think this, right? And of course, string theorists have reasons for thinking that. But I think some of those reasons, if they're honest, are aesthetic reasons, right? They like the fact that the mathematics of string theory comes together really beautifully and elegantly. And that's a big part of why they like it. And again, that's not just true of string theory. So even though that criticism gets leveled at string theorists more often than at anybody else, that's because string theory is the biggest program,
that people have heard of, and like
exactly. So if loop quantum gravity became more popular, then I think that criticism would get leveled at loop quantum gravity more and more, right? And so anyway, but again, that's not really how science is supposed to work, right? Science is supposed to work where our criteria are a strict correspondence between the quantitative predictions of some physical theory and the actual quantitative measurements of some experimental outcome. So that's where science actually works, right? Science doesn't work very well at these weird frontiers where we're pushing in strange ways.
Right.
And you can see that it doesn't work very well because we've been working on the problem of quantum gravity for the past 60 years, and we have made, I think, really very little progress in any real way.
Right. So. I mean, but it is also a very difficult question. So, I mean,
it is, but what makes it difficult is this lack of experimental input.
Oh, well.
So my prediction, honestly, is that we will continue to fumble around and mess it up until we actually make one of those observations that I was alluding to earlier, right? So we will observe,
and then people will get excited.
And then people will crack the code,
right?
Like what will happen is that we'll observe, some strong quantum fields close to the inner horizon of some black hole, and boom, it'll be like, well, hell, the answer is clearly that we should be doing this, right?
Right.
Like, and then all of us who are sitting around, armchair quarterbacking the whole thing are going to say like, oh, okay, well, all right, cool. I guess I'll stop doing that now. We'll stop doing, I'll stop doing my crazy thing, and string theorists will stop doing their crazy thing, and we'll stop doing their crazy thing, and we'll all start
just jump onto the
about doing what is actually related,
observable and related,
to the observable.
Sure. Well, I mean, that just narrows it down suddenly, right? Like, it's a weird. That is something that's unlikely to happen in most like fields of art. Well, if we're talking about creativity, like right now, everybody can sort of do their own thing because there's no clear answer. But once a discovery is made, that's like, no, guys, we really should probably be honing in on this because this is clearly where this is coming from, and then everybody's going to jump ship and do that. Whereas it's unlikely that anything is going to happen in the fantasy genre where suddenly everybody is writing epic fantasy about dragons, and nobody's writing anything
because
else.
That's the only thing that's okay now.
Yeah, right. There's like,
I agree, and that's where the fact that we, despite the fact that we're off in La La Land sometimes, that's where the fact that we are still physicists really sort of kicks in, right? I mean, one of the reasons that the sciences do make progress is because at the end of the day, we all agree that experiment determines the answers to these questions, right? And so once a solid, repeatable experiment has been done to a high degree of statistical accuracy, we all say, okay, cool. We're going to stop doing whatever we thought we were supposed to do, and we're going to start doing things that agree with that experimental result.
Right.
So.
And there will still probably be one person who's going to be like, I don't think that that's actually the way, even though we have this observable fact. But
No, that's true.
Which is fine,
so
right? Because you want people to question it.
Yeah, physics is certainly not without cranks. On the one hand, right? Because frankly, some of the people who do that are they are so psychologically incapable of switching, right? That they keep doing one thing despite the fact that everybody else has said, whoa, that doesn't make any sense, right? Look at all these results that tell you that isn't going to work.
Right.
But then there is a second side about people continuing to push, right? And sometimes the things that are widely accepted do need to be pushed in physics, right? It is not. And this is where the whole epistemology of science gets really challenging, right? It's usually not so clear cut when an experiment dictates a particular sort of theoretical, not result, because that's actually much too specific, but even sort of like a general theoretical framework is usually it's not cut and dried when that is indicated by a particular set of experimental results. The more experiments accumulate, the clearer usually those questions tend to get. But there are, it's been over 100 years since the advent of quantum theory and since the experimental predictions of quantum mechanics were really well documented. And yet there are ongoing debates about the meaning of quantum mechanics, right? What the real physical meaning of quantum theory is.
Right.
So even when the sort of general theoretical framework is pretty well established by some experimental results, that doesn't mean that the physical interpretation, right, the question of like what is quote really happening here gets answered.
Right.
So clearly there's more room to push on those kinds of questions.
So then that creativity continues to come into play even once we've got more observations lined up. So that's I don't know. I think that's pretty.
And the experimental creativity never ends, right?
Right.
I mean, so we've had laser interferometers for decades and decades and decades, but the LIGO interferometers are a whole other kind of thing, right? I mean, I think we were talking about this a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
And it's always shocking to anybody. I mean, within or outside of the physics community, it is shocking for people to realize that the interferometers at LIGO are measuring the change in position of mirrors by less. This change in position between the two mirrors in LIGO interferometers is less than the width of the nucleus of an atom, and that is measurable with an interferometer is just, I mean, it passes understanding, right?
Amazing.
And sure enough, when the LIGO collaboration first proposed the whole project to detect gravitational waves by measuring the displacement of these mirrors when a gravitational wave came by, the question, of course, was, okay, yeah, great. That sounds like a great idea. So these mirrors are going to move, and that'll tell us the gravitational wave came by, and how much are the mirrors going to move? And they told them, right? And the answer was, get out of here. Like, what are you talking about? You're never going to measure something that small, right? Like, that's ridiculous. But here we are, decades later, and sure enough, those experimentalists did it. Because instead of sitting around trying to think shit up, they were hard at work making the interferometers work better.
Well, they were trying to think up like really freaking precise ways to measure shit.
That's exactly right. And there is tremendous creativity required in that process. This is not, oh well, we're gonna go to one of the late Radio Shack stores and pick up some components and build LIGO, right? This is let's think about new materials, and let's think about whole new approaches to signal processing, and let's think about how to quantum squeeze a laser beam. I mean, like crazy stuff. And
then the computing to actually like have access to that information even, right? Because you can't, like, you can set up all those instruments in a room, and if you don't hook that up to a computer somehow, there's no way a human can actually monitor that, right? No, like that's like,
no, definitely not. This is all algorithmic. Everything about LIGO is algorithmic processing.
But it's just mind-boggling. We've had people watching, and there are people that we know and people that we don't know. I would like to point out that Philip is here, and so Philip Goldston is here, and of course we knew that Jill was already here. We've also got Sheldrix Abroad, who I have a guess as to who that actually is, but I'm not sure. But it's not a person that you know. An internet acquaintance of mine. And also we have Misty306, who is our like QuaranCon super fan. She comes to every single event that we have, which is super awesome. And she's just sending a quick hello. She's at work. Oh, not allowed to watch streaming events at work. Dang. Sorry. Gotcha. Sorry, Lois. And Philip has said hi again. Hi. So we do have some questions showing up. They are D&D questions. So
okay, well, that's not
yeah.
really related to my role as a theoretical physicist, but it's definitely something else that I do. So.
I did tout it in the advertising, the promotion for the interview. That is okay. Sheldrick's abroad. Yes, I thought that was Anna. Okay, hi Anna. That was my guess. But so and just based on your question, Anna, I figured it was you, but because she is definitely the person who would show up and ask. Not only she's like it's a D&D science crossover question, which I feel is appropriate since she is a science teacher and a DM.
Wow, well, I'm fascinated to hear a D&D science crossover question. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't think I could come up with one. So
well, she came up with one, so here we go. All right. So we're because. Well, okay, so there are more of the science and arts questions, and we could maybe put off the D&D questions I had sort of put off for later. I don't know. F it. We're just gonna go with Anna's question for now, and then because she's here.
Sure.
So Anna asks, she said, I thought of a D&D/science question. Have you ever tried to create a D&D adventure based on science or using scientific theories? For example, she says, I'm slowly building a dungeon based off the Fibonacci sequence.
Oh, that's okay. All right. So that's actually, that's a more literal question than I had taken it at the beginning. So I certainly have thought of trying to write science fiction that was trying to build on ideas from quantum ontology and things like that to try to make different technologies which seem kind of magical.
Right.
Work, right? So I mean, you've probably read in popular science articles about like quantum teleportation and things like that, right? So there are at least pseudo-scientific ways to bring some quantum theory into things. And general relativity, at least mathematically, allows for wormholes and time travel and things like that. Those all require stress energy, which doesn't exist. A type of stress energy tensor, which doesn't actually exist in nature. But anyway, so like, you can sort of pseudoscience your way into some really interesting, like, teleportation.
And I often do.
Wormhole. Right. Yeah, that's right. So this is definitely related to some Victoria Marmot stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I've certainly thought about trying to do something like that. But no, okay, so this was actually a more literal question in the sense of like, how would you actually build an adventure using components? I've never thought of doing it, but now that I have been invited to think about doing it, I wonder if you could do something where you were doing like an adventure through some sort of material or even through the subatomic structure of an atom or something like that, where the enemies were things like, various nucleons and electrons and things like that, right? Because you were trying to make your way to some part of a crystalline lattice or some part of a, whatever. So
this is like the Adventures of Ant-Man. Like you do, you've gone into it. Yeah.
So you would have to have a tiny little microscopic protagonist or set of protagonists, and then the enemies or the traps or whatever would all be parts of some atomic or subatomic structure. So off the top of my head, that's the first thing that I came up with. So I was thinking of like,
I like it. I'm down. Really I'll play it.
You could do this. Yeah, I mean, it could be fun, right? You could do some really interesting dungeon planning with different spin networks, actually. So I don't know if she's super interested in spin networks and quantum gravity theories, but if you look up spin networks on Wikipedia, you'll see some interesting graphs, and that will give you a sense about like connecting different things with different weights and things like that. So you definitely could. You could do, because she was talking about Fibonacci sequence and like actually procedurally generating a dungeon using the Fibonacci sequence and using a spin network, like a realistic quantum gravitational spin network from loop quantum gravity to generate a dungeon, and like the lengths of corridors could relate to the spins on the different links. And anyway, so it's definitely possible in many I have to admit, I'm usually a little bit more of a sort of, I don't know, bread and butter sort of Dungeons and Dragons kind of dungeon master and player, but that's just me.
I mean, I imagine if we thought about it longer, I'm sure we could merge the two and come up with some way to make
for sure.
that.
It could be an elf that was traveling through that of an atom. You know, I mean, like,
there's really no reason for it not to be an elf.
I agree. That's right. It's just as likely as a human traveling through the nucleus of an atom. So.
But yeah, thanks, Anna. That's a fun question. for those who don't know, I did mention on Twitter and on a couple other spots that yeah, in addition to, like, Tom is not only my brother, he's also my DM. So I would say 99% of the Dungeons and Dragons campaigns I've ever participated in have been DM'd by Tom, and then like 1 or 2 by our mom before you learned how to DM, and then there's like one other that I've played in like outside of our family. And so we, you know, this is a thing, like part of the reason that I felt that Tom was a good person to have on QuaranCon is because he's multiple kinds of nerds at once, as I feel most of us are, right? Like very few of us are just one kind of nerd, right? Like,
it's true. I think there's a personality that goes along with it and tends to.
It's to get excited about, you know, different things. Like I think being a nerd is really all about passion for a topic or topics. And there are some people who are really like wholly invested in one thing, but there are a lot of us who I think, you know, are like to get excited about a lot of things.
Sure.
And so yeah, so we have been playing Dungeons and Dragons together since I was like 8 and you were 10 or before?
I think that's right. That's what I was going to throw
8 and 10,
just after we moved to Germany.
Germany, yeah.
Yep.
I remember getting like those little lead figurines at a little shop in Germany and then painting them.
Which could not have been good for us, but yes, I do remember having the little lead figurines. At the time, of course, I wasn't thinking about that, but
yeah, I was not putting them in my mouth.
No, that's
thankfully.
right. Well, I don't remember seeing it on any.
But still, we were doing a lot of like, you know.
Oh yeah.
And I might have been putting my hands in my mouth after.
Yeah, I don't like to think about that, but yeah, that's true. If I hadn't played with lead figurines at the age of 10, I would have solved the problem of quantum gravity.
And I would be, you know, writing Pulitzer Prize award-winning novels. But no, I would still be writing fantasy stuff, but maybe Hugo-winning novels. There we go. I would not be interested in writing anything that is likely to win any of those big literary awards. A Hugo, sure. Nebula, yeah.
Sounds good.
So yeah, this is also part of why I thought that Tom was in particular a good person to talk to about the intersection of science and art, because I while we've not actually had a ton of conversations about that previously, we've had many conversations about your various artistic and creative interests, and also about science separately. But it's always been clear to me that you are a very creative person, and that I think that that's true of a lot of scientists. You know, I know a lot of engineers who are also actors or playwrights, or, you know, like I know a lot of a lot of scientists who are also artists in some way. I do also know a fair number of people who are scientists and feel like they cannot be creative because of that.
Right.
Which is always an interesting conversation to me, because I'm like, but dude, like science is so creative. Like how are you, you know, why do you think you're bad at creativity? And also like, why does that have to stop you? Like be bad at it, but like freaking do whatever you want. Play bad ukulele, or, you know, like, or write bad stories, or
is by being bad at it for a very long time. Right? So, I think that's a really interesting question, where the idea that science and creativity are in fact antithetical. You know, and I wonder if some of it goes back to, so there are, I think it's a little bit less common nowadays, but there are at least sort of branches of various scientific disciplines which are very, very observation-based.
That's
not experiment-based, right? Not experimental in the sense that you get to create the experiment, which is a creative process. You figure out what technologies or what other sort of, what information structures in a questionnaire or whatever, right? How you're going to get at answering some question experimentally. So you create that experiment and then you run it and then you try to interpret the data. That's a very creative process, which we usually associate nowadays with experimental science. Right. So let alone theoretical science, where you're clearly like coming up with ideas, right? And that's a necessarily creative process. But I think that it used to be the case, right? That the idea of what a botanist did, for instance, was you went out into unexplored parts of the forest or the jungle or whatever, and you would look for things, right? And you would look for a flower. And if you saw a flower, you didn't make anything up, right? You just like you drew it in painstaking detail, or you picked it and you smushed it in some paper and then you brought it home, right? And that was the extent of that scientific process, was, I think, the feeling, right? Even then, I'm not sure that that's really true, right? Because the whole business of trying to categorize and trying to figure out the sort
find
of similarities, right? I think that also was probably at least a somewhat creative process, although I have no practical experience doing it. But so I think that was probably an overreaction, but I can at least see where this idea may have started.
Yeah.
But I think that that's an extremely antiquated view, right? Even to the degree that it was an appropriate view to hold 300 years ago about botany. I don't even think that it's true of botany anymore, right? I mean, I bet that botanists these days, right, are looking at, like, are doing experiments on flowers and other plants, right, and are probing the biochemical structure of things, and like, I'll bet that they're doing all sorts of things which are much more obviously experimental and creative.
There's been a bunch of cool research lately on like what plants like feel, and like the way that plants react to music and people's voices and interact with each other, and the amount of information that plants can actually spread to each other and stuff. That's been amazing. And the thought process of coming up with the experiments to observe that is like that had to have been creative, right? Like, because that was basically
definitely not just drawing pictures of flowers, right?
No, or even just observe, like counting pine needles on a branch to see which kind of, whatever it is. It's like a very to come up with that. You had to have been thinking creatively. There's no
So I think maybe that's where that idea came from. But as I've said many times now, I don't think that it holds. I don't think it holds water.
Right.
I don't think that there are very many parts of science anymore, and I'm not sure that there ever were, although I'm not an historian of science. I'm a theoretical physicist, but I'm not sure there ever were many parts of science which were purely just cataloging things in a completely, completely detached sort of way, right? So it's a strange question as to where that notion came from. Except again that I think sometimes we tell ourselves this story in physics and probably in other sciences too, that tries to play up how objective and how discovered rather than created or authored scientific law or equations or theories or hypotheses or whatever are, and play down how much creative work, how much authorship went into that whole enterprise, right? So I think there is this business of the scientists trying to fool maybe themselves and people outside of science into thinking that the role of the scientist is if not less than it really is, at least different from what it really is.
Right. Trying to make it seem perhaps more objective than it inherently
I think that's right.
is, right? Like, because obviously if you're coming up with stuff, there's way more room for inherent bias than if you're discovering things.
Sure. Right? Or why didn't you come up with something else?
Right.
Is there something else you could have come up with which would also explain the results of this experiment? We never know.
Right. Yeah.
That's not the case. Right. Thank goodness. Otherwise, this would be a very boring sort of endeavor. But no, it's quite different from saying like, oh, look, a flower, which we haven't seen before. Here it is, right? Like, let me give that to you. I discovered it, right? Like, I didn't make up this flower.
Right.
I didn't author the flower. I didn't, So I can at least see that there's a tension there, right?
Sure.
And we still to this day talk about discovering scientific law or discovering scientific theories, right? As opposed to authoring them. Right. And I think it's bad language, but there it is. So we use it inside the community and outside the community. So
it's interesting framing, right?
It is.
But it's funny, like there is a degree to which people talk about that for the creative process in art as well, like talking about the way ideas are sort of revealed in their own head and stuff.
Sure.
And while part of me, like, I don't like to disassociate myself from my writing, like, like as an author, I can make choices and change things, but I do feel that there is a degree to which like characters do stuff, right? Like I write a scene and my brain supplies without, and of course it's just that it's a subconscious more than a conscious effect, right? But that my brain supplies like, and then this happened. And I'm like, oh, no shit, that did happen. That's hilarious. They're like, I was not expecting that. And I'll surprise myself, which is a weird thing. Sure. And so I get why people talk about it that way. I've had that experience and felt that moment, like feeling like it's like I'm discovering things about my characters and about the world and about stuff, and it's sort of just being laid out in front of me. But of course it's my own brain doing it. I don't personally feel like it is, an external force at all, or that it doesn't make it my choices and stuff, right? But
you're right that there is, subjectively, our conscious mind is not the part that comes up with those new ideas, right? And so there is a very real sense in which you sometimes find yourself sort of examining some new idea which has come out of your mind, but which seems like this very sort of strange and external and alien thing, and you're looking at it and you're like, wait, what the hell is that? Like, who ordered that on the menu, right? So yeah, I think
this is not the equation I asked for.
Right, yeah, that's right. Where did this come from? Oh, I see. It did come from my mind. But so I think that that's true, and that may be part of it. That may be part of why people talk about discovering these sorts of scientific theories or equations or laws or whatever. I think the problem for me is that there's, the thing that gets produced by your subconscious and that you then sort of look at and inspect and think about and then later critique and build on and interpret and contextualize. There is all that other work has to happen before something counts as a scientific law or a scientific theory or even a hypothesis, right? Yeah. And so treating those end products as if they hadn't been authored, even though it sometimes seems to us like that first spark of inspiration or that first idea or that first take is somehow discovered, or at the very least is not something that we control directly. Right. Even if that is the case, all that extra work, right, has to be done. And that's the work of authorship, right? And as you pointed out, even artistically, that's the same sort of phenomenon that happens, right? Like you have this idea and you may find it weird or you may find it stunning or whatever, but then you actually have to go back through and you have to turn it into some words on a page, or you have to turn it into a sculpture in a garden, or you have to turn it into whatever, right? Depending upon what the medium is. And so, I think those processes of taking that raw idea or that raw inspiration and creating something out of it, which is, which meets the sort of accepted criteria for your medium, whatever that is, right, is a process that is at least analogous in science and in the arts. Yeah. Certainly not the same process, right? And I would not try to argue that it's the same process, but I do think that there are very, very real parallels.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like as you said, one of the key differences is that we hope that the scientific authoring goes through a slightly more strenuous critique than the arts necessarily.
I don't know.
Right?
Lots of book reviewers will tear you up, right?
Yeah, that is. but that happens after publication, right? Well, so it's like part of.
That's a good point.
Yeah, like the editorial process happens before that, like where you critique yourself and you have a trusted person who critiques the work before that. And then once it's out in the world, I mean, people will say all kinds of shit about it. But it's just like,
to me, I think the biggest difference is the nature of the standards that we are applying, right? And that in the sciences, I think most of us know what they are, right? We know what the standard is. The standard is, does this agree with experiment or not, right? And sometimes the answer is nobody knows, right? And so that's a standard that you can't meet. And that's the basic problem with quantum gravity programs right now. Is that you trot out these ideas and you try to polish them up and you try to make everything fit together really nicely, and then you say at the end, okay, does it agree with experiment? And you say nobody knows because we don't have any experiments to compare this to, right? Like this is talking about aspects of reality which we have not probed experimentally yet, right? And so we don't know, and then we're in trouble, right? That's where we sometimes stop acting like scientists, right? And we start using other criteria, right? But for things that really count as science, and we maybe exclude quantum gravity for a while until we have some better experiments, for things that are really science, then we do know what those standards are, right? And I think that's the primary difference, right? The standards are of a different kind, right? This notion of correspondence to experiment, and they are accepted, if not completely universally, then at least by everybody who's really within the scientific community for the most part, right? Because sort of like the key thing you have to buy into to be part of the scientific community is that you believe that experiment and observation and fact, as challenging as that notion of fact may sometimes be, that is at the end of the day what we're searching for and what we want to compare ourselves to and our theories to.
Yeah. Which I think actually makes a key difference. You talked about reviews, and I think that actually makes a key difference in the artistic versus scientific output and then critique, right? Because the important critique for a work of art comes from inside the house, right? Like you critique yourself, your editor critiques your stuff, right? But there's this sort of internal, and then it goes out in the world, and then some people may love it and some people may hate it, but it's done. That's the thing. In the scientific community, you develop an idea to the best of your ability on your own, and you maybe have someone read over the paper a couple times beforehand, but then you publish it, and then the scientific community judges it to those universally held, or mostly universally held standards, and says, no, dude, you you totally ignored all this other stuff. Or actually, I mean, like, that is at least feasible and we have nothing to disprove it at the moment. Or, that assessment is part of the validity, the credibility of a scientific paper, right? Whereas once a work of art is published or put in the world, like, the critiques that come after that don't actually affect its artness, right? Like, it's still art. Really good point. You might think it's bad art, you might think it's good art, but it's still art, and there's nothing you can do.
No, that's right. It's not invalid art because you didn't like it, right? Whereas your hypothesis may be invalid because somebody says, hey, look, I did this experiment, and guess what? You were totally wrong. Right? You said we were going to get the answer 17, and we actually got the answer -4. Right? So thumbs down.
Thumbs down.
You definitely missed something.
Right. And the result can in fact be like, oh, no, dude, you didn't even science properly, right? Like, if you're writing up, if your paper is in fact an analysis of a study, there people can be like, well, no, dude, like, there wasn't a control, or you didn't do this, or you didn't, so like this is actually invalid science. Like, not only is it wrong, you didn't do the thing properly.
Right.
And I think people try to do that sometimes with art, but technically, generally speaking, whatever you produce with the intent of it being art is art. And and again, you get a lot of wide variety on people's reactions to that. But but that is
at the very least, the things that push the envelope in that sense are usually pretty easily recognizable, right? Like, I mean, this is not somebody typing out a book full of English language words and sentences, and somebody says, no, that's not a novel, like that doesn't really happen, right? We can argue about Duchamp's urinal, but we're not likely to argue about like the fact that you wrote a novel or didn't write a novel, right?
Right. No, that's true. That is, although, but people might say, well, this isn't even a work of fiction, which that would be a weird one, but
maybe, right?
It's usually pretty clear.
Wrong. Right.
Yeah. And that is also the thing, right? Like, there's a whole piece to then like art and selling art that complicates matters further, right? That there's not and you're usually, I won't say never, because of course there's definitely a commercial aspect to science, but you're usually, when you're publishing a paper, not necessarily trying to sell the science.
Right. At least we hope not.
Right. Yeah, because then your science is probably not.
I mean, you're very often trying to sell engineering.
Sure.
Right. But even then, I mean, usually things you're trying to sell, you don't publish in journals, right? Because that is to just give it out, right? So if you're trying to sell it, usually you'd like to keep it, and then you don't sell the ideas, right? You sell some output.
Right.
So when things get patented or trademarked or become trade secrets or whatever, that's a whole other process, that commercial side. Not that science is unrelated to that, right? Or certainly not that engineering is unrelated to that, right? I mean, an awful lot of that is doing engineering, but
and actually, so that aspect of science leads into another one of my questions, which is that lots of people recognize, I think, how, especially during a pandemic, like right now, I think a lot of people recognize how the arts improve their day-to-day life. It has really if the pandemic has done anything besides kill a lot of people, it has shown it has sort of shone a light on the arts and how much we as humans rely on arts for our well-being. which is pretty cool. I mean, I am not a fan of the pandemic, and I would like it to have never happened, and I would like it to go away. But one of the weird silver linings has been a lot of people vocally recognizing how important music and art and the film industry and books have been in helping them maintain a reasonable state of well-being.
Yeah.
So right now, I think we get a lot of people accepting that arts improve our day-to-day lives.
Sure.
But how can the average person learn to appreciate that science helps their day-to-day life as well? I mean, they're the really obvious ones where it's like you're holding a phone. Science is what made the phone happen, right? Like, but there are other pieces to that too. So would you be willing to talk about that for a bit? Like, what are some takeaways people can?
No, I mean, I think the phone example is a good one. The one that I was going to bring out, because you were talking about COVID, is that when COVID goes away, it's going to be because a bunch of biologists are awfully good at doing biology.
Yeah.
So that's why we have science, right? The practical output of science is technology.
Right.
Understanding how the world works allows us to harness the different processes that exist in nature and build technologies that at least hopefully make our lives better. Now, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, right? More often than either of those is that they do some of both, right?
Right. Yeah.
But technology is definitely the practical output of science. But there are two problems here. The first one is that usually when one is doing fundamental science, and by that I don't just mean like fundamental physics. I mean fundamental science in any field, right? In biology and chemistry and whatever. The ultimate technological output of those ideas is not at all apparent when you're actually working on them as a scientist, right? So we scientists don't do them because we know what the output is going to be on the other side, and because we're really primarily interested in technology. We do them because we're passionate about learning how the world works, right? We want to explore nature and unravel mysteries and ask big questions and hopefully come up with answers, right? But so a good example is the telephone, right? But back when Planck was doing experiments which were going to birth quantum theory in the next few years at the turn of the 20th century, nobody had any friggin' idea that we were going to have telephones and computers because of quantum theory, right? Like nobody had any idea about that at all. And if you had proposed that something like that was going to happen because of the early proto attempts at quantum theory, people would have laughed at you. At the very least, it would have been science fiction and not science.
Yep.
And so the first problem is that the link between doing basic science and having ultimately new technologies is not one that anybody understands at the beginning.
Right.
And so it would be tempting from a sort of public policy perspective or a sort of like global ethical perspective or something like that, right? To say, okay, well, fine, then we should fund and we should work on those scientific enterprises, which are ultimately going to result in life-saving or life-benefiting technologies, right? But we have no idea what those are going to be, right? But the second problem, which is even maybe more of a problem than the first, because the first is only about funding, right? Like scientists don't need any extra, like impetus to do science, right? All they need are the tools to do science. And oftentimes, there are people who are willing to give money to those things. Now, would LIGO or CERN or some huge multi-billion-dollar science project get built without funding from the NSF or some other government agencies or something like that? No, probably not, right? Because people don't usually have billions of dollars to give away for science projects. But research would not stop if public funding were less, because people in general had this attitude, I think it's the wrong attitude, but this attitude that science was not going to pay off, right? The second problem, though, is that people don't really appreciate science, right? So people are talking on their cell phones and they don't think to themselves, oh, thousands upon thousands of scientists and engineers and people worked really hard so that I could have this in my hand. They just think like, well, damn, this thing costs too much, like.
But the battery keeps dying.
Right, or exactly. The battery keeps dying, or the reception keeps falling out. Right. Like, think about the fact that it's amazing that you have reception in the first place, right? Now, this is not to say that it's not frustrating when your cell phone call dies, and I always find myself cursing, the cell company also when my reception goes out. But I think what we don't mostly do, even I as a scientist, right? My first reaction is stupid cell phone, like this is not working right. My reaction is not usually to like hang up the phone and think to myself, or talk to somebody on Zoom and think to myself, can you believe it? Somebody is thousands of miles away, and here I am seeing their face and hearing their words. And how did that work? It worked because we figured out how electrons flow through conductors. It worked because we figured out how to send and receive radio waves. It worked because we figured out quantum theory and learned how to build semiconductors. I mean, like the list
the optical
goes on and on and on,
sensors,
right? It's an incredible list of things, which are these outputs, but we as human beings just habituate to what's around us.
Right.
And so we don't actually appreciate the output of science because it's become so commonplace that we think like, it's my cell phone. If anything, we curse it because it doesn't work just the way we want.
Right.
We don't think to ourselves, wow, I can't believe that all those thousands of people were so brilliant and did such great work.
Yeah, totally.
So I think, it's true. And I think that's what's different, right? Like when you see a new work of art, it's new, right? And you see this new work of art and you see these actors on this in this movie that you haven't seen before, or you read these words in this book that you haven't read before from an author you haven't read before, and you think, how new and incredible, right? I'm so glad that these people made this movie, or I'm so glad that these people, or that this person wrote this novel, right?
Yeah.
But you pick up a cell phone and you don't think to yourself like, oh my God, how amazing that these thousands of people did this incredible work and made these fundamental discoveries and then harnessed these really difficult physical ideas and put together these technologies in this factory that cost billions of dollars to build and then ultimately delivered me this cell phone. Instead, we just think like, reception on this cell phone sucks. I'm getting a new one.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And it's kind of crazy. I mean, I actually do take time out of my day sometimes to marvel at the fact that I have a supercomputer in my pocket.
It's true.
Or that I have access to the internet and all that means in my pocket, or, or even on my laptop, because, and I think back to like the stories that even our parents would tell about how many rooms it took up for the computers that ran the reservation system for airlines, right? Like, a thing that now I could do 10 times better than those machines did on my cell phone.
Absolutely true.
In fact, I could probably just make a spreadsheet that would work better than their original operation system, right? But which would of course be now like way worse than an actual reservation system, modern reservation system, but still it would be 1,000 times better than what they were working with in the 60s. Anyway, and I do think about that stuff sometimes, and my mind is boggled, and sometimes I use that to sort of extrapolate from where we are now and to where we might be 100 years in the future. And I do think that is a thing that a lot of fantasy and particularly sci-fi authors do, is sort of take that, like, here's our day-to-day and all the stuff that we take for granted, and like what's that going to look like 100 years from now? And of course we can't know, but it's a really interesting question, and it's fun to guess about, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Here's a question. So a lot of scientists that get interviewed on television, which is actually not a lot of scientists, but of the ones,
it's not a common thing.
But of the ones that do get interviewed and stuff, it's always interesting to me the number of actual scientists who have been inspired by fiction, right? Like, I recently read a brief article about one of the astronauts who is, I think, currently in the space station, who was inspired by Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek, and who is now an astronaut herself, but she showed up on an episode of Star Trek, and she became the first actual astronaut to be on an episode of Star Trek, which is extra cool. Awesome. And a nice little So but all to say, like, it's always cool to me, especially as someone who spends their life creating fiction, right? Like the number of scientists who are inspired by fiction and then use that to come up with something that's actually cool, or to become an astronaut, or to, and so one of my questions was, for you personally, where did this question go? It was in here somewhere. Nope. Really? No, here it is. It's back here. It was earlier. I went past it earlier. Okay. So, what art, any media, it could be books, movies, music, whatever, has had the most influence on your life, and also on your science, if any?
That's a really, really interesting question. Wow.
I did send it to you in advance, but
No, I know. I thought about it a little bit yesterday when I first saw it, and I thought, oh man, that's a really hard question. I don't know how I'm going to answer that. But here I am trying to answer it. But I think in terms of inspiration for science, and this goes back to a very, very early sort of inspiration in science, and maybe one of the reasons why ultimately I did choose to do theoretical physics. I have to cite Dungeons and Dragons as a yeah, no, I thought that answer would probably make you happy, but in a sort of way, right? Like Dungeons and Dragons makes, I remember being really, really struck by and thinking a lot about the rules in Dungeons and Dragons when I was little, right? And thinking to myself, well, wait, but I mean, in real life, obviously nobody's rolling dice to determine the outcome of, right? Like if I try to kick this soccer ball, I don't roll 1d20 and add a dexterity modifier and blah, blah, blah to see what happens, right? Like that's not what happens. So what are the rules that make things work in real life? And to what degree, I mean, the question that was in my mind.
To what degree are you rolling a d20?
was sort of like, well, so what? So the Dungeons and Dragons rules are kind of bogus, right? Like we're obviously not rolling d20s and stuff like that, but and obviously there are lots of missing ingredients. But when I was a kid, I was sort of thinking to myself, like, well, could I make a more realistic rule set to describe how, there's a reason that I've often gravitated toward the dungeon master side of Dungeons and Dragons as opposed to the player side, right? But the rules have always been really interested to me, and so I was always interested in like coming up with different systems of rules and which ones would better reflect the way that things actually worked in the world. It always struck me as really strange that in Dungeons and Dragons you roll once to see if your character does or does not hit with a melee weapon or a spell attack or a ranged attack or whatever. And then separately you roll damage as if the success of your attack was not somehow going to influence the damage, right? Like if I hit you in the eye, that is a different sort of damage that I expect to do with my dagger than if I hit you in the toe, right? So anyway, so like those kinds of things really struck me as a child even, right? And like, well, so could we come up with a better set of rules? But I think generally,
which is that's an interesting physics question. Could we come up with a better set of rules?
Exactly, and that's my point. And I think decades later that still continues to inspire me in the sense of like, well, can we come up with a better set of rules? Right? Can we come up with a better set of equations to better describe the way that these things work? And so I think that interest, like, can I come up with a better set of rules, goes back at least to Dungeons and Dragons. But I can't necessarily think of it going back too much farther than that. And so I think there's a sense in which Dungeons and Dragons has been a huge inspiration for me, but in this very bizarre way, right? Not in this player-oriented, like it's the fantasy element of it.
Right.
It's in this like dungeon master. It was the rules. Like how do I figure out the rules and how do I write better rules and what do the rules really imply, right? Like I've always been more interested, even from the player side, in sort of like power gaming the different classes and things like that. And like, this would be the perfect combination of choices for this class to make it like the most powerful damage output or something like that, right? That sort of side of it has always interested me more than the side of like, oh, and my character is from this place and my character is from this. That. Like, I mean, that I love doing that on the Dungeon Master side. I love world building. I love making non-player characters who are eminently hateable, and like all those sorts of things, right? But yeah, somehow the rule side has been, I think, the thing that somehow has influenced my science more.
Yeah.
And it's very specific to the type of science that I do, right? So when you were asking, like, why did you become a theoretical physicist, right? Like high energy theoretical physicist doing quantum theories of gravity, right?
Dungeons and Dragons.
The fundamental rules that describe how things work, right? And I think that really is a big part of it.
Yeah. I am smiling extra as you describe this because I'm getting so many memories of not just D&D campaigns, but also the ways in which in your life and in our childhood, rules mattered so much to you.
Yes.
And
sad but true. Yeah.
I have always approached it from a slightly different angle. I have never been like, how can we make have better rules? I've always been like, how can I break the rules and do the thing that I want to do regardless of rules? And so I actually think that's kind of a funny take on the fact that I became a writer of fantasy novels and you became a scientist because you were looking for a better rule set. And I was like, no, forget the rules. Let's do this.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I think that some of those psychological differences are evident, as you said, very, very early on.
Yeah.
right? I mean, I don't think there's anything that determined that I was going to become
No.
a theoretical physicist, but the fact that I do something that's related to rules and equations and things like that, right? I don't think that that's accidental, right? Like,
No.
if I were not a theoretical physicist, I could easily see myself designing role-playing games,
Yeah.
right? So, but again, that's rules, right? Like, it's coming up with the rules, and then and then putting, wrapping them in a context which gets people really excited about it, right? So
Totally.
wrapping them in the context of fantasy or science fiction or whatever, right? Something that really draws people into them.
Yeah.
But I've often thought of the fact that not only Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games, right? At the end of the day, what are we doing, right? We're rolling dice, and then we're interpreting the outcomes, right? It's a little strange that some of us spend so much time doing it. But this is not just a critique of Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure it's a critique of anything at all. But like, if you think about it, what are you doing when you play a video game like World of Warcraft?
I mean, it's all live action fantasy
on your keyboard, and you are clicking a mouse. This is precisely what you get paid to do at work for most of us, right? Like, why do you pay money to do one and you get money to, anyway? So, but I think, the whole point is that context, right? Like, nobody plays a role-playing game because they just love the rule set, right? Like, they want a whole fantasy world that is built around that rule set and that works well with that rule set, right? So anyway, that's all to say, but the part that to me would draw me in would be the building of the rules. Right? Like, that to me would be the really fun part. And then, I would need to contextualize. I mean, I do like a certain part of the contextualization process and the world building and things like that. I think that part is fun too. But, there would be so much other work that needed to happen to make a marketable role-playing game, right? Like, there would be all the graphical design work. There would be the actual writing of the rule books and things like that, right? And some of the storytelling aspects I would like, but the actual part of writing it, like, no. And the layout of it and all that sort of stuff, like,
those are usually done by whole teams, like creative teams.
No,
but
exactly,
that's
right? And that's why you have teams to do anything that is complicated. It's because the same person doesn't gravitate toward all the different roles that need to be filled in order to make something happen, right? But so anyway, that's all just by way of saying, I don't think it was determined that I would become a theoretical physicist, but if I were a role-playing game designer, it would be the rules that would really suck me in, right? And that I'd be most passionate about making. And that I don't think is an asset, right? The fact that whatever I was doing, I would probably gravitate towards the systems and the rules and those sorts of things. That part probably is actually fundamental to my personality. Or at least my psychology.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's kind of fun and brilliant. I do also think, though, that there is an aspect of storytelling to not just like, I mean, obviously to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, I think it's actually pretty obvious that there's a lot of storytelling that goes hand in hand with either being the DM or the player, and that a lot of what people get out of that entire experience is the like sort of live action fantasy storytelling, right?
For sure.
But
nobody just likes rolling d20s.
Right. I mean, some people, I really do like dice, like that's actually like a really pretty dice. And like, but and Cedar, like my daughter, like that clarifying for people at home, not for you, but
as soon as I said that, I thought of Jack too, who also really just loves to roll dice.
Likes to roll dice.
Just like rolling dice. So as soon as I said, I knew it was wrong, but apparently it's wrong also for you and for Cedar, so I totally take it off this.
But Cedar really loves rolling dice, and so she'll play Dungeons and Dragons with me. And she likes storytelling too, right? So we will tell stories and roll dice, and the dice rolling and the stories are fairly disconnected at this point, but she likes to do both. But what I was going to say, like the end game there, is that I actually think that a lot of what draws humans to science as well is also storytelling. The story of humans and how we exist in the universe and how the universe exists around us. And I actually think that there is a huge storytelling aspect to science. It's a different type of storytelling because, again, it's more trying to uncover what things actually are instead of but as you said, like there's an authorship to that, right? Like, and so you are still authoring your theory of how things work.
Absolutely.
And so but that part is fascinating to me. That's the thing where I'm like, but it's so, like, I feel like the more we talk about it and think about it, the more I think the more aspects of science and arts overlap,
Well, so here's what I would say though. I think that the scientific enterprise as a whole, right? And let me even just restrict that to physics, right? Which is what I actually know about.
Right.
the story that we tell in physics, right? The ongoing collaborative story that we tell in physics is much more similar to a game of Dungeons and Dragons than it is to authoring a novel, I think,
Right.
in the sense that it's collaborative, right?
Right.
You're not doing it by yourself, right? You are doing it in collaboration, I mean, in physics, in the case of physics, with thousands of people
Right.
around the world. And you're not just making up a story, right? You're making up a story according to very specific rules.
Rule sets.
Right? So the rule set is very, very important, right?
Yep.
And there is this shared rule set. And that does sort of help keep everybody on the same page, right?
Yep.
So, you know, if in Dungeons and Dragons, somebody says like, well, you know, and then I, you know, bring down a planet on top of this person's head. You're like, what the hell are you talking about? A 13th level fighter can't bring down a planet on top of anybody's head. Like, what? You have some artifact I don't know about or something? Like, this is ridiculous, right? And then you say, no, the rules don't allow you to do what you just told me
Right.
you want to do, right? Whereas in a novel, I mean, there's nothing in principle that keeps you. I mean, yes, the internal logic of the novel dictates that you don't do these things. But there's no rule
Right.
set that is keeping you from doing that, right? In science, it's even stronger than in Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
Right? It's not even like you can say like, oh, look, here's an equation. Isn't it cool? And people
Yeah.
are like, what are you talking about? That has nothing to do with anything. Like, look,
Yeah.
if that were true, it would mean this and this and this, and those are all wrong. And so like, you know,
Yeah.
go home. So I think there are even stronger parallels probably to be made to a game of Dungeons and Dragons than even to authoring a novel. But I think even authoring a novel, there are still parallels to be drawn. It occurs to me now that there are even stronger parallels to be drawn.
To be on Dungeons
The
and Dragons,
cooperative rule-based storytelling of Dungeons and Dragons and the sort of enterprise of physics.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point. And it's true that in writing a novel, you absolutely can break even your internal structure. But exactly, that's the problem, right? You lose readership when you do that, because I think there is an inherent human interest in some set of rules, right? Like that there's some set of rules that govern things, and so you can bend the crap out of those. But if you entirely break them, you lose readership.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's what draws people to Dungeons and Dragons, and it's what draws people to science. And I
think that's true. I think the difference really for an author is not that there aren't internal rules for authoring good novels. I think the challenges are A, you don't necessarily always know what they are, and B, there is no one from the outside who's going to
tell you them.
Right?
Exactly,
so not only do you not know what they are, maybe nobody knows what they are, right? And so it's
Yep. And then you have to check yourself for them, or you have to try to teach them well enough to an editor that they can help you check for them. Right. And that is its own set of challenges, right? Yeah. So that's always interesting. Okay, we have covered a lot of the questions that I sent you. We've rolled a number of questions into those answers. So now we've got a couple more slightly frivolous questions. But not really frivolous, because I think we've made it very clear that the ties between the arts and entertainment and science. So the fact that we're going to veer more towards artsy, entertainment-y things is not actually less serious. But my first question, and maybe because we've been going for an hour and 25 minutes now, these things always run long. I try to keep them to 90 minutes. That never happens. But if we could keep it to an hour 45, maybe that'd be good. But somewhat briefly, how little we know about space. Like, as someone who studies the theoretical physics, or is a theoretical physicist, I think it's probably clearer to you than it is to most of us, even, how little we know about space. So
misuse the term. Yeah.
Well, okay, that's fair. But do you ever stop and just think about the ocean and how little we know about the ocean, and how it
is such an interesting question. And yesterday when you sent it to me, I was struck by the question, because the answer is no. And that's what is so striking to me about the answer to the question, right? Like, the answer is no. I don't stop and think about how little we know about the depths of the ocean, right? Which is shocking, because how can the same person who's so interested in knowing what the fundamental nature of space and time is be so uninterested in knowing what's at the bottom of the ocean, right? Or like how, and yet that's what was so striking. Yeah. The honest answer is no. Not in the sense that I don't that I
it's
wouldn't
cool.
sort of be curious to know
Right, yeah.
what's at the bottom of the ocean, that I don't hope other people are really passionate to know the answer about what's at the bottom of the ocean. It's just to say that personally, no, I find the ocean terrifying and not really that interesting simultaneously. And so it's just shocking, right? Like the shocking thing is like, wait, how can your curiosity and your interest and your passion be so focused on just these few things, right? Like, why is it that you're passionate about like quantum theories of gravity and coffee and wine and Dungeons and Dragons,
but not the ocean, and not
but not all these other things, right? Why are you not passionate about all these other things?
But you only have so much time in a day, right?
I don't know the answer. Yeah, I guess that's true, but yeah, I don't know. I think some part of it is just some weird subjective resonance that some things have for us and some things don't, right? I mean, like, presumably if we talked to an eminent deep sea oceanographer or something like that, they would give precisely the opposite answer, right? They would be like, oh, I'm so passionate about knowing, like I love taking my submersible down and like seeing what's deep down in the ocean, and there are these crazy alien looking creatures, and then you're like, oh yeah, but what about the fundamental nature of space and time? And they're probably like,
sounds cool for somebody else.
They would say like, oh yeah, I'm super passionate about that too. I mean, on quantum gravity all the time, right? But my bet is that instead they'd be like, yeah, I mean, I'm glad there are people who do that, but no, I don't really want to like go to school and learn theoretical physics now. So it's,
well, that's I mean, that's the thing though, right? Like you only have so much time in your days and your life to delve into these things. So it's like, if you're,
but there's got to be something else, right? Because if I did have more time, it still wouldn't be underwater oceanography that I did.
Okay,
right? It would be, it would be, I don't know, like developing rule sets for role-playing games or something like that. It would be something else that I'm passionate about, right? Like we would have to go pretty far down a list to get to, like.
But that's sort of what I mean, right? But that's sort of what I mean, though, right? Like you have this list of things that you're interested in. Yeah. But again, like so but if you had infinite time, maybe then you would be interested in the ocean, right?
Definitely.
But if you have a limited amount of time, you have a hierarchy of things, and you're like, no, I like this and this and this and this and this, and like the ocean's way down here, and so I don't usually stop even in the middle of my day and think about anything about the depths of the ocean except that they're terrifying.
Right. And that's usually when I go to the ocean and remember the movie Jaws. So, but I think, but part of the problem may be that I didn't watch enough Octonauts as a kid. I mean, that's not a problem because there were no Octonauts shows when I was a kid, I don't think. But, like if I'd watch more Octonauts, will Jack and Charlie, who love Octonauts, will they become interested in being underwater explorers? Maybe so, right? Yeah. But then again, I mean, it's not like I was reading string theory texts when I was 9 either, right? But you
were watching Star Trek.
I was watching, that's true, right? I was watching Star Trek and I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? And getting interested in rules and in the idea of like that there are these rules that affect how things work. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that we read the book The Way Things Work a bunch as kids, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Which I don't that actually that sort of sparked a lot of my interest in physics, honestly.
Yeah. See, but this is one of the interesting
things. But that's
things.
Newtonian.
And I think this is one of the reasons why I am a quantum gravity theorist as opposed to something more practical, right? I was never very if in mechanical things.
Right.
And to this day, that's the case, right? I mean, like if I had a student this term who asked me if I would help her, if I would be a faculty sponsor for a student club that was all about like learning how to fix things and repair things and learning how different like construction tools and things like that work. Yeah. And I said, I'm sorry, you have the wrong McClain. Like the McClain in my household who builds things and fixes things is my wife, right? Because she is great at those things and loves like fiddling with things and making them work and all. And I'm like, no, look, if you want me to like, solve an equation for you that tells you how that thing works, yes, great, I'll do that. But if you want to know the rules about how that thing works, then you can come to me, right? But if you actually want to like make it work and like twist it and move, no, I'm the wrong McClain.
And for people watching who aren't related to us, you might be interested to know that in fact, in our childhood, when there was when there were activities that were centered around like building stuff that were like construction, that was always me and either mom or dad. And because mom built a lot of stuff very haphazardly. Dad built a lot of stuff overbuilding it and making it like super strong. But at any rate, I remember specifically like for your Boy Scout, like you got to build a race car, you got to build a sailboat, whatever. You had zero interest, and Dad and I built all of your race cars and sailboats and stuff, and then went and launched them. And I wasn't allowed to be a Boy Scout, and I was so pissed because you guys had all these cool activities where you got to build stuff, and I was always the one building them with Dad. So Dad and I would like go off and build this thing, and then you would paint it. True. And then that would be
no, it's true. The only things I can ever remember building with a lot as a kid was Legos. Yeah, that's right. But yeah, even then, I think that my favorite thing was actually playing with the things I built. Right. Like what was fun for me was like putting things together and then telling some story or like doing something with the Legos after I built them. Right. It wasn't so much that.
And you were also always into building the thing on the box, right?
True. Like, no, that's true, right? There are rules already. You're supposed to build with this. So let's build that, damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Very true.
And then using that as a toy. Anyway. I have to say it's extra fun to have this conversation and have all these little personal insights from our childhood to throw in as illustrations. But okay, so that was I love that you're not at all interested in the ocean, like just because.
It's sad, but it's true.
No, I love the honesty of it, but I also love that, like, you know, like we all have our passions, and we started this conversation talking about how we're all multiple kinds of nerd, but we're not every kind of nerd, right? Like, no, so true. Of all the kinds of nerd that you are not an ocean nerd.
Right.
And that's
nope,
fine,
I'm not.
Right?
I'm
like
not
that's not
I could see myself becoming a sailing nerd. That's only lack of opportunity. That's not lack of but
lack of funds and time.
Yes, that's lack of funds and lack of next to the ocean.
Right.
Or even a big lake where I could sail, right? But but that I could get into, but I don't think underwater exploration would be my thing.
Yeah. Whereas I find I'm so distracted by, like, I love sitting down and like learning about space, and then I love to like watch a video about the depths of the ocean, and then I love to like watch a video about freaking like the life that exists in the desert, and then I like, you know, like, and so all these little things pull on my mind and strike creative sparks for me. And I am not every kind of nerd because I am not an expert in any of those fields, right? But I am the kind of nerd who is really excited to learn about the world, like the world and the universe, period. Like you can just like broach any topic in an interesting way. And this has kind of been the beauty of YouTube and even just like streaming services for cool documentaries and stuff. But like, I love learning about this stuff. I would not have wanted to sit in a classroom and learn from a textbook about bees and how they work, right? Because honestly, the second you mention bees, I'm like, that doesn't sound that interesting. But I have talked to people who are excited about bees and listened to them explain bees, and I'm like, holy shit, that is massively interesting. You're right. You know, for the 20 minutes I'm talking to them, I'm like, that is absolutely one of like the coolest things I've ever heard. You know, and I like that. I like seeing what other thing is the coolest thing I've ever heard for the next 5 minutes. And I think that's really fun. But I get that not everybody wants to do that. And for me, it's all like low-key research for some book someday, right? Like, oh, you know what? They're going to be bees in this. Like, I haven't done that yet, but I might. I could. I could be like, and it's like, what?
I think that's actually one of the flaws of our educational system, though, is that we spend a lot of time trying to get people to remember very dry facts, right? And not enough time sharing our passions about things.
No, that is a really, really good point. It's not we don't teach those things in a great way, because I think
because like you could have, you know, when the section on bees came up, you could presumably contact, you know, like the world's leading expert in bees, right? And
or even just a local beekeeper would probably be super enthusiastic about it, right? Like,
it depends upon the level we're talking about, I guess.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
But and then that person could share not only some dry facts about bees, but also their passion for bees, right? Whereas, you know, if you're just going through the motions as a teacher, right, and you're, you know, you're teaching these things, these dry facts that you're not very interested in, why would the students be interested in, right? Like, so
you're like, great.
It's a big challenge, right?
Yeah.
And it's a big challenge that our system focuses so much on the learning of dry facts, right? And the testing of the learning of dry facts, as opposed to sharing passions and trying to get students to be interested in various things, rather than just teaching them lots of facts about things. A passion is actually valuable and meaningful, and is the thing that will get you to go back and study the textbook,
Yeah.
And learn those dry facts because you have fit them into something that you care about, right? Whereas just fact after fact after fact.
Yawn after yawn
Yeah,
after
it's
yawn.
very clear that doesn't lead anywhere good, right? Just look at the test scores of our. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. No, it's true. It does not lead to internalization at all. Okay, so a slightly even more fun question. No longer talking about whether or not you care about the ocean, but very specifically asking about what you do care about. If you decided to take a year off from being a physicist to pursue an artistic endeavor, and your costs are covered, like you've been given a grant. Here's $50,000 to cover your cost of living for the year, $100,000, whatever it would take, and now you, Tom, may devote an entire year to blah, blank, fill in. What is it? What would you do?
What a great question. So there is an idea that I've had for a long time about a science fiction series, which I would be really, really interested in actually pursuing. The problem is, though, that as we mentioned this earlier, the way you get good at doing something is by sucking at it for a long time. I don't think that I could successfully write a science fiction book in a year, right? I think that it would take me longer than that to really sort of like hit my stride, learning how to write. Now, and this is as somebody who does a lot of writing, right? Just not fiction writing. But learning the art of fiction writing, I think would take a lot longer than a year. So it's a little hard for me to give that answer, even though that's one that I would like to. Since you said artistic and not art, I might go back to role-playing games, role-playing games or board games. I have a lot of ideas about role-playing games and board games, which would be really fun to try to actually put together and hammer out. As you pointed out, though, when we talked about this last time, that really requires a team. And so one of the challenges there is finding the money. So if the money were there not only to pay my living expenses, but also to hire a graphic designer, also to get some good copy editing and right? Then that is probably what I would do.
Luckily, you can get a family discount on copy editing.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You've got a couple copy editors to choose from.
That's true.
But so then, sorry.
So artistic, but not art.
Yeah. Well, that is absolutely. I honestly feel like games in particular. They're not like museum style art, but I do think there's still art in that.
There's certainly a lot of art that goes into them.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's the art not only of the visual or graphical artists who are working on to actually produce pictures that go into the rule books or onto the board or into the video game or whatever. There's also, of course, all the storytelling. Right. There's a lot of art going on in the storytelling of it too. I don't know. I don't know to what degree the rule set, for instance, is. So anyway, that's all.
Okay. So the rule set, but
there's a lot of art that goes into a game.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I also think that the end result is almost an interactive form of art because it is sort of an interactive form of storytelling. And so I think that if we're going to call storytelling a form of art, then I do think that games in general count. It's just that they're weird, like not weird. They're different in the way that they are very much affected by the player, right? But that is honestly, we don't give enough credit, I think, to the way that affects all art, right? Like the person experiencing it greatly
is not an accidental or an unimportant part of
the and so there's this, like once it's out in the world, like the book was mine and I had these intentions and I did this thing, but once the book is out in the world, my intentions don't really matter anymore. Now it is the down to the individual experience of the reader. So I didn't mean for it to be this thing, but that doesn't matter. They took it that way and that was their experience of it. And there's nothing I do can change that. That's
that's an interesting point.
And so similarly, you put a role-playing game in the hands of a DM and players, and then their experience of it is sort of an act of art. There's and that's true with video games too, I think. Anyway, I follow a lot of gamers on Twitter and game designers and developers. And I think that we we don't appreciate the art that goes into that as much as we should.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Yeah.
And I do think that those people deserve that artistic recognition, because especially the storytelling too, right? Like there's some video games.
Yeah.
The storytelling that goes into that is
Yep.
is so much work and so much more than a novel, because you not only have to tell, like, you're not just telling one story, you're telling this overall arc, but then there's like this million variations on how that plays out, and you have to account for all of that, and just like, it's phenomenal work. And again, it's a team effort, but it's I don't know, I think it's cool, and I think it's art personally. But okay, we are now moving into pure silliness, and we're going to wrap things up. So
okay, ready for pure silliness.
Yes.
This is a high bar though.
What movie do you most often quote with friends? I have some guesses because I know
what an
but
interesting question.
Is that actually interesting?
I feel like because I'm not sure that I must.
You do. You randomly throw out movie quotes, right? Like there are day-to-day expressions that you use that are actually.
Wow. Okay. Well, this is one where I'm not sure that I'll be able to answer, but it sounds like you'll be able to answer.
Well, no, but solid gold hubcaps.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Quote from Robin Hood.
The cartoon version of Robin Hood. Whoa, wow, you're right. But I guess these things are like so deeply embedded in my day-to-day experience that I don't notice them anymore. Like most people in their cell phone, right? Like,
right.
Oh, that's so interesting. Wow.
So it may be hard to narrow down because there are quite a few, but like the ones that occur to me are like solid gold hubcaps. What else? I don't know. Well, can you think? Yeah,
I don't know either.
There's because they're all.
I wouldn't even be able to think of that one. Although
that
you're
one
right,
just came to me right now.
not all the time,
but often.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that I also say it, and I'm not sure if I started saying it because you say it or if I started saying it anyway. I honestly don't know. We both watched that movie a lot as children.
Yes,
and anytime someone says solid gold, the thing I think of is solid hubcaps. But
man, that's wild.
But
so surely there are other movies that I quote, but that's funny. I think I've just sort of co-opted the phrases to the point where I don't really think of them as movie quotes anymore. I just think of them as
they're just
silly things that I say.
Yes.
Huh.
Okay, well, so then that's a hard one to nail down then.
It is. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's totally fine. I'm very disappointed, Tom, that you couldn't.
I know
answer
there
the
was
totally
a disappointing
question.
answer. I can't think of any movies that I quote, which is unfortunately the true answer. But yeah.
But what really
apparently
just means
I do quote them.
You do, yes. You've just internalized them so much you don't even recognize them as movie quotes anymore. It's all right.
Now I'm wondering what the other ones are.
Well, I'm gonna try to come up with a list now. We'll see. I'm waiting for at this point. I'm like, well, and Jill's around. Maybe she could tell us if she can think of any. But okay, next question. Super important. Heat is on. Who makes the best coffee in our family?
Ooh, oh man, this is a little. This is gonna cause some friction. Maybe, I don't know. No, I think Randy has actually stopped making coffee. So
unless when they have visitors. I think it's kind of the same as you. It's like special occasion. He's also still.
No, I'm back to actually making coffee all the time and roasting myself again.
Oh, so it's still a tight call. It's down because personally, I think it's down to you and Randy, and I'm not sure I can really say who does better.
I'm not sure either. I don't know what to say. I do really like Randy's method. Randy's method is pretty cool.
Randy's coffee. Is
Randy may have it.
Yeah.
If he's back to roasting and making coffee. I was thinking I might win because he was out. How does the second fastest person in the world become, the record holder? Well, the first fastest person in the world has to stop running.
Yeah.
But.
We've had video chats with Jill where they're like Randy's roaster's been going on the patio, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And recently too. So no, I think you're probably right. So I think Randy probably has it.
Might have to give it to Randy. All right. Fair enough. Well, I'm glad we took care of that. And I'm sure everybody else who's watching this really cares. So
yes. That probably
moving on.
upset a lot of people.
Oh, Jill says he makes pour over most days, also roasting himself, and he's got quite the coffee roaster now. So yeah, it's probably going to be Randy now. For everyone who's watching at home and is not part of our family, we have, in addition to like all the other nerdery in our family, we have some of the highest level coffee nerds that you will ever encounter. We're talking.
That's a pretty tall order.
Well, okay, no, I mean like who are not professional coffee roasters, right? Like this is purely
amateur coffee nerd
for fun, and we have two members of our family who roast their own beans and then do very elaborate coffee.
Right. Have tried every method of making coffee known to man, or inventing their own. In Randy's case,
which
that's why I have to give the nod to Randy because he wins.
Yeah, it does sound like Jill's saying he's doing pour overs now, so it's
true, which may mean
he's not doing the vacuum.
I know, right? Because now there's pour over is a tricky thing.
Yeah, but I do know that we have some coffee aficionados in. Anna says, "I see your family and raise you mine."
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
We may have some competition for the nerdiest nerds. Philip says, sounds like I might need to up my game before your next visit. I wouldn't worry about it, Philip. Because if for my next visit, like we grind our beans and we make our coffee. We're not at the TJ and Randy level, the Tom and Randy level of.
If you grind your own beans right before you make coffee, I think you've reached 90% of the actual quality output. And that last 10%, this is like so many other things, right? That last 10% actually costs you 90% of the effort. The most important part was just get a grinder and grind your beans right before you make coffee. After that, it's probably going to be okay.
Nice. Oh man.
Okay, if the beans are terrible, it's not going to be okay.
That's true. It's not going to be okay. But here we have Anna, though. She is upping us. She says 1 owns a coffee chain in Australia and 3 have barista qualifications just because they were bored.
Well, I think
so Anna, okay. I take back my earlier assertion that we have some of the nerdiest coffee nerds that outside of professional.
Walking it back.
Roasters. Although the one that owns 3 coffee chains, that is clearly that is professional level coffee.
That's true. Yeah.
But the 3 that just have barista qualifications for funsies, I think that trumps us.
That wins.
It's like those people know how to run an espresso machine, which I do not. I mean, I conceptually yes, but I have not. I cannot. If I ever could afford an espresso machine, I would not be able to operate it without training myself first. So, all right. So now we're on to our final question, which is, of course,
the most important one, I'm sure.
The most important.
Given the tenor of these questions as we're going along.
Yeah, most important. Definitely not the silliest. Absolutely not the thing you're going to be least excited to answer. What is, Tom, the most embarrassing story about yourself that you are willing to talk about on the internet?
Oh, man.
So there's a qualifier.
This is another one that I was like, this is tricky.
And if your answer is, I'm not willing to tell any embarrassing stories about myself on the internet, that's totally fine. You do not have to embarrass yourself for me. I can do it for you, but
no.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a separate question. What's the most embarrassing story about me that you know? I think so. I'm going to tell a particular one because it's a cautionary tale, and so it will be a nice little piece of anti-bullying propaganda.
Oh, good.
So when I was,
I know.
So now you know the story.
I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah. So when we lived in Germany, I was 10 to 12 or something like that, right? And we went to an international school in Frankfurt. And so being American, I was taller than most. I mean, obviously the Dutch kids were probably taller than I was, and then I was also just sort of freakishly tall at a young age. So I sort of towered above a lot of the other kids on the playground, and I was an asshole. There really aren't any two ways about it. So so there was some day when I was being a jerk on the playground, as I often was. And I think I was trying to tell some kid from Scandinavia, although he was not super tall, despite the fact that he could have been based on ethnicity and stuff. Anyway, whatever. So I was trying to tell the Scandinavian kid, like, get off the monkey bars, they're my monkey bars, or some equally ridiculous thing, right?
Right.
And typically what happened was that the kid would just get off the monkey bars, right? But this kid was like, no, boom, right in the mouth, right? And knocks off half of my right front tooth.
I didn't know that was the story of how you lost the half.
That is the story about how I lost that part of my tooth.
Yeah.
And was a wonderful turning point in my life. I really have to thank this Scandinavian kid. I totally forget what his name was, for standing up to my bullying at the early age of, like 11 or whatever I was, right? But pretty embarrassing that I was such a jerk when I was 11.
Yeah. We both had issues with that. I was also an asshole as a small child, and weirdly, I got over it before I even got to high school. I think I got over it in middle school, similarly. Not because I got punched in the face by anybody.
Well, some of us need more, sort of like help in our education than others.
Well, no, but I think it was largely because I wound up on the receiving end of some social bullying. I was not punched in the face, but I was way more, when we came back from Germany, I was quite the little outcast at our next school. And for a while I had some friends, and then those friends decided they weren't my friends anymore. And again, I don't know, like, this is the problem, right? Like when you were a jerk as a kid and your memory is not that great, it's like, I don't actually remember if I did, like, in my memory, I did not do anything to spark the turn against me from these friends, but maybe I did, like I was a little asshole. So maybe I was just being a little asshole, and they were like, we're not friends with you anymore. And yet I have other friends from that time period who corroborate my impression of it, and who are also really nice people now. And that makes me want to at least trust them, right? Like maybe it was unjustified, but yeah, I started being less of a jerk after that. And maybe it's just
to a large degree, right? So, I guess something has to prompt you to want to learn that.
Yeah. And I like to think that I was sort of developing it in addition to that it wasn't just that people were mean to me that made me stop being mean. But I know I had a couple issues of being just a little tyrant with my friends sometimes. Although I do actually remember part of what made me want to curb, like you and I both have issues with a flaring temper. And when I was little, because little kids don't have filters and they don't have the consequence, processing and anything, like it was violence. That was my reaction to things, like something I don't like. I sometimes reacted violently to that, and so I remember there was one, like I punched a kid when I was like 5 because we would started playing this game, and then she changed the
sandbox game.
Yeah, it was a sandbox game. Where I was like, we're digging for dinosaurs, and then she and then I finally, when I was bored with it, I was like, no, there aren't any real dinosaurs. Like, this was just pretend. And she like kept insisting, and then I hit her because of course that's what you do. Because I was an asshole. I sometimes use my powers for good. I actually did beat up a bully once around the same age. There was a person who was going around flipping up girls' skirts, and I
remember this story too.
Took him to town for that. But
this is not giving viewers a great impression.
I know,
of our,
right?
Of our
we
family.
were shitty, but then
his parents.
But actually, one of the things that made me start to work on that was there was at one point we were in Germany, you were standing up on top of a desk for some reason. And I was really jealous of something that you were doing. And I would think it was Boy Scouts related. At least there were like Boy Scout activities going on. At any rate, I pushed you off of the desk. And you very narrowly avoided serious injury. And I immediately felt awful. And I remember thinking from that point on, like I would have been so sad if I had actually like seriously hurt Tom, right? And I was like, that would have, I think my brain was like, do you have any idea what you almost did just there? Because it was close. Like it was like your head came this close to hitting something really hard, and the way you fell was like, it could have been so awful. And I remember having a really visceral reaction to it. Like the thing I remember most about that, like I can't remember why I was mad, and I can't remember why I pushed you, and I can't remember I can't remember why I was a jerk. I just remember immediately afterward being so scared by my reaction, right?
Yeah.
Just being like, your reaction to being upset was violence, and you almost hurt one of your favorite people, because even though we didn't, get along all the time throughout our childhood, you were still like one of my best friends, and I'm getting emotional now talking about it. But I totally I sort of made a decision from then on to like work on it. And I know I've said this before for myself, and I think you've agreed with me at one point, like learning martial arts was a huge portion to helping me control my violent temper. Having a very channeled and directed outlet for that, but also starting meditation practices and stuff, like learning, when you and I started learning martial arts when we were little, that was a huge help to me curbing that. And actually from then on, I actually had way fewer violent reactions, or I was at least able to stop them. Like I would start to feel like I was going to do something violent, and I would be able to sort of channel away from that. And part of that was also just getting older and having more abilities to stop.
No, I think that's definitely part of it. I would add also, though, that I think that learning martial arts does two other things. I think one, it makes you feel less powerless. I think a lot of the reason that we get angry and that people try to bully one another is because they feel afraid, and it's their way of lashing out and trying to quell that fear. But I think learning martial arts helps you feel less afraid. It helps you feel more powerful. But with that power comes the second thing, which is you start to feel like, no, I am a dangerous person now, right? And I know ways to hurt people that I know will hurt people. And with that comes the responsibility to not do it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just me doing my normal thing, right, and deciding that, it'll be fine if I get angry, right? I think it's that same sort of lesson that you were just talking about, wow, I really could have hurt that person. I think when you start learning martial arts, you start to realize it's really not that hard to hurt people. And that means that I really have to watch what I'm doing. I can't just go through the world lashing out violently and thinking that magically everything's going to be okay.
Right.
And especially not now, because now I really know how to hurt people on purpose.
Yeah.
And
our senseis were good about that too. I felt in making that message clear. Like, yes, we're teaching you how to do this, but the whole point is so that you don't really we're teaching you how to hurt people and hoping that you never will, right? Which I thought was a great lesson at that point. And that the sort of the discipline side of that. And I was never super into rules the way you were. And so having people say we're teaching you to do these things and you can't do them, it's not like that was inherently like, oh, okay, I'm cool with that. Like, no, I was always like, F you and your rules. But with that one, I felt it, I was like, yes, this is something that I need to be responsible about. And I understand that because I think they made it really clear. It's like, we're only teaching you this if you promise to not try to use it a lot, right? Especially I think when they teach kids, they make a particular point of that, right? Like, don't, if we hear that you're bullying you in your schools or whatever, bullying kids at school, if you're using this to hurt people, we won't teach you anymore. And I was like, no, but I really want to learn to be a badass, so please teach me. and I don't need to use it at school. But as you said, that confidence makes you feel less like you need to use it, right? You're like, no, I'm okay, I can. So, and that was around the same time as the social bullying that I was describing that happened to me. So I actually do think I might have been becoming less of an asshole already, and it might not have been my fault, but interesting. Okay, so we went from silly to very, very serious.
Back to very serious, and clean and all. Oh man.
Yeah.
Well, still.
But so to anyone watching, please be nice to each other. I think that is certainly, I am very much not the small child that I was that lashed out with violence and that tried to be violent to people I disagreed with and or anybody who made me mad. And I'm it's pretty safe to say Tom was also not that person anymore. And we realize how awful it was. I mean, I actually really appreciate at least the perspective I have on it now. Yeah. I look back at my childhood, I'm like, oh, I was just a kid and it was whatever and not a big deal. I'm like, no, I was that was problematic. I should not. Even as a child, I wish I hadn't done that. I don't think I had a huge amount of control over it, but I do wish that I had been better. And I do, and if I hadn't learned the lessons I learned, I would be a very different person. And and
Yeah.
the potential for that to being a really bad person is there. And I think that's an important thing to recognize about yourself, right? That like,
Well, it's there in all of us, right? We all have the potential to be bad people, and we also
Yeah.
have the potential to not be bad people.
and it comes down to our choices and our circumstance to some degree.
It certainly is much, much harder for some people to overcome the influences that are pushing them to lash out, to hurt people, and to hurt themselves.
Yeah. Okay, well,
but Dumbledore is still right in the end.
Like which quote?
Oh, this is in book 1, right? It is,
Oh,
it
okay.
is not our abilities that
But it's-
define who we are. It's our choices.
True story.
It's a slight paraphrase, I think, but yeah.
Close enough. Okay, well, now I feel like I need to ask like one more totally frivolous question to get us
I
back
don't know,
on track.
we'll probably turn it dark really quickly.
Let's see what we can do. If you could be any fantasy animal, what would you be and why?
Oh, well, that one's easy. And unfortunately, though, it's also gonna, like, anybody who's read
Same
all
answer.
of the books is gonna know what my answer is too. So it's gonna seem very derivative coming from me because I've already read it from you. But the answer, of course, is that I want to be a dragon, right? Like, then I get to. Well, okay, it depends on what kind of dragon, right?
True.
I'm actually not totally sure that I want to be the kind of dragon who's always in dragon form. But this is like what I really want to be is like a Dungeons and Dragons dragon or a Shadowrun dragon or something like that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Shapeshift and has magic and is also super big and powerful and armored and can fly. I mean, like, who wouldn't want to fly? But yeah, that's definitely my answer.
That's fair. You'll be not surprised to know that that is the answer of like 99% of the people I
know,
ask this
but
question.
that's why it's kind of a sad answer, right? It's like, yeah, the same thing everybody else wants to be a dragon.
Yeah, it's a dragon. But it's interesting though, because I've asked this question of a ton of fantasy authors who don't write dragon stories, etc.
Sure.
And the answer still tends to be dragon.
Right.
The variations on this are like either they want to be a dragon or they want to be they want to be a dragon or they want to have a dragon companion. Because I sometimes ask if you could have any fantasy companion animal, would it be? And the answer is also always
companion might not be the best plan, right?
That's the thing, and then it comes very much down to what kind of dragon.
Second of all, you're no longer the hero of your own story. You're now the sidekick in this story. And second of all, you're also lunch if the dragon gets hungry.
But this is the thing: is that people then they come up with like
nice
that they're in a fantasy world where dragons aren't super intelligent, or they're more like it's.
Then
like
I would not want to be a dragon.
No, of course, but that changes but it's still some variation on dragon that they want by their side. Like, yeah, I want the fire-breathing, flying companion animal.
Tank. The fire-breathing flying tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
But I personally I don't want a dragon pet. Like I like the versions of dragons that are like highly intelligent, smarter than humans, and will absolutely eat you for upsetting them. And so it's always, but still some variation of dragon always winds up being the thing.
Yeah.
And when people have tried to change their answer, they've been like, oh, well, maybe this, but yeah, probably a dragon.
Yeah.
So what are you gonna do? Okay, but at least we've stuck to frivolous.
We did.
That did not go too deep. So we will end it on that note. And I will say huge thank you to everyone who came to watch and ask questions. Philip, so lovely to see you. Jill, we love you. Thanks for being here. Anna, thanks so much for showing up and asking really interesting D&D science crossover questions. Misty had to go back to work, but Misty, if you come back and watch us later, thanks for showing up. And A.F. Stewart, thank you also for being here. If anyone wants to ask additional questions in the comments underneath the video, this chat sort of like isn't visible unless you're watching the video. I think it shows up when you watch the video as it happens, but you can't really insert anything else into it later. So for anyone who watches this later, feel free to add questions to the under video comments, and I might, if I see anything, I'll poke Tom and tell him to come answer questions. And thank you so much, Tom, for your time. We took 2 hours away from valuable sitting around and thinking time. I really appreciate the sacrifice.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, but this has been really lovely. So I am going to click the button that ends the live stream now, but you can stick around and we can chat for a minute. All right, thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time. I actually don't have another video lined up just yet for QuaranCon continuing content, but